This masonry is wondrous. Fates broke it. Courtyard pavements were smashed. The work of giants is decaying. Welcome to Ruins. This time on Ruins, we're visiting Raphoe Castle, which is located in County Donegal, Ireland's northernmost county. In addition to being a local landmark, it boasts an average 3.4 out of 5 stars on Google Places, including one review by a local guide, which claims that the place is inaccessibile, in Italian. The castle's story was one of constant resistance against the forces which surrounded it. War and rebellion could only damage it. Its demise only came at peacetime.
Now, with that kind of description, you'd probably think this castle was the property of somebody fearsome, combative, and you'd be correct. But it wasn't built by a king or a lord or even a chieftain. No, it was built by one Dr. John Leslie, Bishop of Raphoe.
Wait, what? This castle was built by a priest?
Yeah, Anglican bishop. Come on, let's take a look inside. Very elegant approach. Now, as you can see, there's not a lot left of the place. We'll talk more about that later. For now, just take in the wonderful views of this haunted husk of a hermitage.
Technically, this was not a hermitage, as no monks lived here. Rather, it was a bishop's palace or episcopal.
To quote the great Peter Falk, "You're very smart, now shut up."
And really, the use of the term castle is debatable, as neither a king nor a noble built it. Although, looking at the architecture gives us strong clues as to the purpose of the building. The 4-foot thick walls, the obvious battlements, and towers at each corner reveal that it was meant first and foremost as a fortification. It should also be noted, as pointed out by the blog The Irish Ascete, that the building actually used to be 1 story shorter. Another level was added about 100 years after the initial construction.
Now inside, you can still make out certain rooms and features, like the towers here. You can see the basic outline of where the internal walls would have been. The castle's construction was completed in the late 1630s. It's actually right around this time that the bishop was married, possibly for the first time in 1638. He was around 60 years old at the time, or as he would have called it, his middle age. His bride was one Catherine Cunningham. Her family was the namesake of Manor Cunningham and Newton Cunningham. She was 19 at the time.
Leslie was a staunch royalist, believing strongly in the king as the rightful ruler and head of the church. 3 different kings appointed him to Privy Council, which he considered his greatest accomplishment.
Point being, the crown loved Leslie, and Leslie loved the crown. The Catholic Irish did not love the crown. In 1641, they decided to let the crown know what they thought of it. Not the show with Doctor Who, the crown as the British royalty. So they staged the Irish Rebellion of 1641. The idea being that with a show of force, they could improve their position in life by having laws repealed that had curtailed some of their freedom.
The Catholic nobles formed a plan to show that the nation supported the Catholic cause. They ostensibly wanted a bloodless coup, so they enacted a plan to take possession of strategic positions without actually attacking them, only occupying them. The idea was that, given this show of force, the crown would be forced to give them what they wanted: tolerance for their religion and assurance that the place that the Catholic gentry enjoyed in Irish society would be preserved. But all their intentions were no match for the reality of escalation during wartime. In the interest of avoiding controversy, we're going to skip over a lot of what happened after the initial coup, as it's difficult to find an unbiased source. So we'll just say that things didn't go according to plan, and that a full-on civil war broke out Soon, shows of brutality were being committed by both Catholics and Protestants, both as acts of war and as expressions of long-standing tensions. In time, Raphoe Castle found itself in the middle of a hotly contested area.
The bishop himself quickly raised up a foot to support the royalist forces, going to relieve Sir Ralph Gore, who was at the time under siege near Donegal. He's also reported to have run powder up and down the country for various royalist forces. It was for these and other actions that he earned himself the epitaph, the Fighting Bishop. At one point during the conflict, the castle itself was besieged by a Catholic militia, only to be relieved by a mostly Protestant Scottish militia called the Lagoniers, or the Lagan Army,
named after
the area around Raphoe. Not long after this siege, the bishop returned to Scotland, his native country, from Ireland.
As it turns out, the rebellion ended up being only a theater in a larger and tangled war, called the War of the Three Kingdoms. Rebellion and civil war broke out in all corners of Britain and Ireland, except Wales, which seems to be doing very little at the time.
If you are a Welsh historian, please write to us and tell us about the paramount importance of the Welsh portion of the War of the Three Kingdoms.
The following is an abridged list of all the conflicts that comprised the war. The Bishops' War, Scottish Civil War, Confederate Ireland, Cromwellian Conquest, the First, Second, and Third English Civil Wars.
It was during the Cromwellian conquests that the bishop returned to Raphoe, hoping to hold out against what he saw as apostate anti-royalism. But this time, the Presbyterian Lagoniers decided to side against his side, and they did the besieging. So the bishop ended up being one of the last Anglicans and royalists to hold out against the Cromwellian conquests in Ireland. And so after submitting to Cromwell, the bishop returned to Scotland. However, he was quickly allowed to return, as the powers that were preferred a powerful and strong Protestant presence to a strong Catholic one.
After the death of Cromwell, the previous royalist system was restored during the Restoration, hence why it was called the Restoration. But things would never be quite the same in the kingdoms. The monarch now ruled in constant fear, not only of other nations, but of his own. As for Ireland, it now experienced more British control than ever due to Cromwell's actions. And Leslie found himself ever more in the favor of ruling classes, being given a pension of £2,000 a year. And so the harshest and strangest chapters of Leslie's life concluded, and he lived out his 100 years in relative quiet. If you've learned anything about him so far, you would understand the word relatively. For example, some years later, in his zeal to attend the coronation, he rode from Chester, which is near Wales, clear to London in just 24 hours. He was 90 at the time.
But castles of wood and stone have a tendency to outlive their owners, even if they do live to be 100. So is the story with Raphoe Castle, and its story continues.
The Williamite War in Ireland, known in Irish as the War of the Two Kings, was one theater of larger machinations by various European powers to check the influence of a surging France through a series of interrelated conflicts called the 9 Years' War. It was what some consider the first global war, although with a far lower death toll and impact on the civilian population than the more well-known ones. The war was probably the one that had the most direct effect on modern Ireland. Many customs, attitudes, and fears can be traced back to the war. How one views the war is largely dependent on how their upbringing was, or what sort of school they went to. The war is best remembered in Ireland for the Siege of Derry, or the Battle of Kinsale, where those aligned with King James II, most of whom were Catholic Jacobites, fought for control of Ireland against the Protestant William of Orange. It should be noted that it is well documented that some Catholics and Protestants fought on either side, showing that the war was not purely about religion, but by and large the dividing lines were between denominations.
In 1689, war again came to Raphoe Castle, if only briefly. The Catholic King James II appears to have simply burnt the place on his way through to more interesting fights.
Is that all we have on that?
It's not like this is the Taj Mahal or anything. There's not been hundreds of years of extensive research on the place. Half the sources I found just plagiarized from the other half, and now we're plagiarizing them. We here at Ruins do not advocate the act of plagiarism or stealing of intellectual property. What you just heard was called a joke, and not an invitation to involve us in a copyright dispute. Anyway, where were we?
We were discussing the first time this place burned
Hey,
down.
spoilers.
Whatever. 6 years after the castle was burned down, it was rebuilt by one Alexander Cairncross, who was appointed as Bishop of Raphoe after having previously been Archbishop of Glasgow.
For the next 100 years or so, the castle remained almost completely undisturbed. War and rebellion no longer touched this part of the country. That is until the United Irishmen rebelled. In the late 18th century, the United Irishmen were a group of Irishmen who were united in their goal for joining the rest of the Western world in revolution.
Members of this movement were active all over Ireland, and Raphoe was no exception. A group of United Irishmen attacked the castle. Little information is available about the siege, other than a report saying that 3 of the attackers died. The attack on the castle, like the rebellion as a whole, ended in defeat for the United Irishmen. The castle remained the property of the church until the 1830s, when the last bishop of Raphoe died. It was then that the see was absorbed and the bishop's palace no longer needed. It was sold off into private hands. Alas, it would remain in those hands but a few moments longer. Just 4 years after the last bishop's death, the castle met its end.
Watch now this historical recreation of the events that led to the final destruction of Raphoe Castle.
How?